Thank you, President, and I'm pleased to make my contribution on this very important legislation. And of course, President, as other members have said, we should acknowledge all those doing great work to keep our community safe and to respond to this significant health challenge. We should also remember, President, how we got here and why we are here. And President, this lockdown, this debate in Parliament today originated in the hotel quarantine fiasco and the refusal of the government to accept ADF support. Now, President, we've seen a conga line of ministers through the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee and senior departmental officials and others all talk about this notion of collective responsibility, collective decision-making, I should say, President, collective decision-making. Seems there's been collective decision-making and no responsibility. Despite days of public hearings from the Coate inquiry, despite days of questioning at PAYAC, no one has yet taken responsibility for the decision to deploy security guards rather than the ADF to the hotel quarantine process, and that is where the COVID genie was let out of the bottle again. Now, there was some dispute about whether the ADF was on offer until Lieutenant General John Fruin appeared at a Senate committee several weeks ago, and following questions from Victorian Senator James Patterson, it was made clear that the ADF offer was on the table, and indeed that offer was taken up by other states. So we are here debating the extension or the need for an extension of the state of emergency because Daniel Andrews and his government, the Gang of Eight, the COVID cabinet, made policy decisions that let the COVID genie out of the bottle. And then we have a shockingly incompetent health minister that failed to deliver the contact tracing system that Victoria needs to enable proper and speedy contact tracing to confine an outbreak when it takes place. The sort of strategy, the sort of work that New South Wales has clearly demonstrated can be done to contain outbreaks. Ms Crozier had spoken previously about the antiquated systems we have in Victoria, where contact tracers make handwritten notes and then put it into an old database, and somehow that's supposed to be matched up to enable that process to continue. Whereas in New South Wales, they have live reporting and live tracing to enable real-time updates about areas of risk, people who need to report and be tested. So, President, we are in this very unfortunate position because of the negligence and the failures of the Andrews government. Now, President, what the government is seeking is not just an extension of the current powers, but an extension of the current powers and giving more power to the Chief Health Officer. Effectively, what the government and Daniel Andrews have done since the establishment of the COVID cabinet is restrict decision-making in Victoria to a handful of members of the executive, the Chief Health Officer, and one or two others. We heard the Secretary of DPC, Chris Eccles, talk about his grand plan to re-engineer Victoria to be more equitable, the sort of platform perhaps someone running for elected office should articulate, not a servant of the government implementing government policy. So Victoria is run by a handful of people. Now, President, is it good practice to continue what we are doing when what we have done in the past has delivered such disastrous outcomes? We have a system of checks and balances in Victoria, in a thriving democracy when it's normally operating, for a reason. Because the robust consideration of different ideas, the robust analysis and consideration of different perspectives improves decision-making. Well, that process has been, swept aside by Daniel Andrews. He's not listening to the caucus, the Labor caucus. He's not listening to most of the Labor cabinet. He's definitely not listening to the opposition. And as we've come to see through the speeches of the members of the crossbench, he's not listening to the crossbench. He's also not listening to a growing chorus of doctors who are concerned about the approach that Daniel Andrews and Jenny Mikakos have taken. You know, when the opposition question the approach of the government seeks to portray us as, extremists or people who are, disrespecting the views of health professionals. Well, health professionals are not some monolith with one singular view of the policy response. And those different perspectives on the appropriate policy response have grown louder as the debate today has become closer. And those medical experts, those healthcare professionals and their views should be considered, they should be tested, they should be analysed, and they should feed into the decision-making process. President, never since Federation has such power been vested in so few, including unelected officials. Never before has Victoria had a curfew imposed, not even during wartime. There's been little analysis, little thought, little consideration given between the nexus of harm to people's livelihoods and health outcomes. Daniel Andrews has bypassed traditional Westminster cabinet, a tradition that has served Victoria well for so long and democracies similar to Victoria for so long. At a time of crisis, these institutions should be drawn upon, should be called upon to be more active, to serve more, to have more input, not brushed aside. It's remarkable that the Legislative Assembly hasn't sat since the 18th of June and that the Legislative Assembly hasn't sat with its full complement of members for 6 months. The failure to release a plan for the phased lifting of restrictions should have been released before debate today. Daniel Andrews has known the 6-month limit or deadline was coming the day he announced the state of emergency. Surely there could have been contingency planning in DPC and DHHS to prepare for the impending end of the state of emergency and what an extension should look like, taking into consideration a range of views and perspectives. The federal government, New South Wales, New Zealand have all had parliamentary committees examine COVID response with non-government chairs. Compare the way that Scott Morrison has facilitated regular briefings to Anthony Albanese, weekly briefings, I understand it, and the opposition. Compare the way the government engages with the opposition here in Victoria. And of course, the Andrews government likes to talk about the code inquiry as some sort of panacea to reveal the truth about what has gone wrong with COVID, when the terms of reference are so narrowly constrained to elements of the hotel quarantine fiasco. And government departments are luring up with QCs and Melbourne's best legal minds to claim executive privilege over the production of documents to the very inquiry Daniel Andrews said will get to the bottom of this mess. What an absolute nonsense. He treats Victorians like fools. It is absolutely staggering that he would say that process is supposed to get to the bottom of the COVID issues when his own government, when his own departments are claiming executive privilege over huge volumes of documents. And I noted with mirth the comments of the board chairperson, Elizabeth Coate, who said there was no prohibition from any member of the community from giving their direct account of what went on with the hotel quarantine fiasco This after weeks of ministers such as Jenny Mikakos saying, I couldn't possibly comment because there's a judicial inquiry. Well, there's no judicial inquiry. There's a board of inquiry established by the Governor and Council with the terms of reference set by the Premier that is not a court, it is not sub judice, and every question put to the Premier and those ministers should be answered clearly, openly and honestly. President, as I say, the contact tracing failures are a significant reason, I believe, why we are still in lockdown, and we don't have an understanding from government or clarity from government about when a system akin to what New South Wales has will be implemented in Victoria. President, Acting President, looking into the future, there's clearly deficiencies in the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the interplay of powers in the Emergency Management Act, pursuant to which the government declared the state of disaster. And the interplay between those two acts and how they operate, I think, is something which would be worth government considering in the future. As has been said by previous speakers, the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and the state of emergency provisions were designed for short-term response to natural disasters, not for a campaign pandemic response. And clearly there's a case for future consideration of legislative change to accommodate the set of circumstances we have at the moment, and hardwiring into the Act the sort of review, the sort of role for Parliament and executive accountability that the government has been so happy to push to a side over recent months. Now, President, I've circulated to members of the Legislative Council the advice of Marcus Clark QC and Ms Vanessa Plain of the Victorian Bar about the risks that the current bill poses, particularly around the issue of proportionality. It's something which I wish to pursue in the committee stage, and I've provided Minister Mikakos with a copy of that advice. I also wish to put on the record my gratitude to Michael Wilds QC for his advice that he has provided, who also raises questions about proportionality and the extent of the powers that this legislation proposes in broadening the remit of the Chief Health Officer, and also the questions he raises about the validity of the decisions made by, or the directives made by Minister Neville pursuant to the state of disaster declaration. The legality of those decisions is something, again, which I wish to pursue in the committee stage. President, finally, this bill will be considered by this place. It will be considered by the other place if it passes here. My concern is with the passage of this legislation, if indeed it does pass, is not just for the immediate term, but the precedent that the Premier and the government have set with their past behaviour in recent months and their wish to extend executive power in the future. The precedent that sets for future governments about the role of the Parliament, the role of the executive, and the accountability of the executive and the check on executive power by the Parliament and the institutions of Victoria. Because, of course, the first time power is used is always the hardest. And now that the Premier has set a precedent for the pushing aside of cabinet government, traditional cabinet government, for the pushing aside of the role of the Parliament, and for diminishing the role of the community in decision-making in these unprecedented times, creates a very dangerous precedent for the future. So, President, I support the amendments that Mr Davis has moved and his attempt to ameliorate this legislation improve accountability, improve transparency, and I look forward to pursuing these and other issues in the committee stage of the bill.